Sunday morning, June 7th, 1942, on the westernmost island of the Alaska chain. A small village is walking home from church. By the end of that day, every single person in it will be a prisoner. One of them will be dead by morning. A man named Charles Foster Jones runs to his radio. He sends one message out: the Japanese have landed. And then he smashes the equipment himself, so the soldiers who are already coming up the beach can't use it. They find him regardless. They ask him to repair it. He refuses again. He's killed the next day. That's usually the only piece of this story that makes it into the history books, if any of it does at all. Most accounts of this island remember what happened here as a footnote, a grim little preamble to a battle that wouldn't actually happen for another 11 months. It shouldn't be a footnote. The battle has its own place in the record. What happened to the roughly 40 people living on this island that morning barely does. This film follows 3 moments. First, the morning this village loses its home. Second, 3 years later, when the survivors are finally freed. And third, the moment that should have been simple and wasn't. What actually happened when they tried to go back. Here's the question this section has to answer. How does a country lose a piece of its own territory and the people living on it and still end up telling this story generations later, primarily as a battle? The Aleut Islands stretch nearly 1,000 miles off the Alaska mainland, and in June of 1942, Japan invaded 2 of the westernmost ones, Kiska on June 6th, Attu on June 7th, as a diversion timed with the attack on Midway. Military historians have generally treated Attu itself as low-value ground, remote, thinly populated, useful mainly as a distraction. A Japanese force of roughly 1,140 infantry under Major Matsutoshi Hosumi took the island without a fight. Then, for nearly a year, very little happened militarily. The United States didn't retake Attu until May of 1943, and it's that battle, not the year that came before it, that dominates almost every account of Attu's role in the Second World War. This is the only land battle of the Second World War, fought on incorporated U.S. territory, and it earned that memory honestly. But a battle was fought over an island that, by the time American troops landed, had already lost the people who'd actually lived there for generations. That's the part of the record worth pulling apart. At the time of the invasion, Attu's village sat around Chichagof Harbor and was home to somewhere between 40 and 45 Unangax, the name the Aleutian Islands' indigenous people use for themselves. Aleut is the name Russian traders gave them centuries ago, and you'll hear both used in the historical record. Living among them were the only 2 non-native residents of the island: Charles Foster Jones, a radio operator and weather observer, working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and his wife Etta, the village schoolteacher and a trained nurse. They'd arrived less than a year earlier. Days before the invasion, Etta had been out on a boat trip and noticed unusual military activity near Dutch Harbor, hundreds of miles to the east, the first sign, in hindsight, that something in the Aleutians was already moving. When Japanese troops came ashore that Sunday morning, the village was walking back from church. Soldiers rounded them up in the open, firing as they advanced, wounding several villagers in the process. According to accounts collected after the war, the village's leader, remembered as Chief Hodikoff, stopped several younger men from reaching for their rifles, warning them it would only get people killed. He's remembered as having told them not to shoot, that the Americans might still come for them. It likely spared the village a massacre that morning. It didn't spare Charles Jones. He was executed the next day after refusing Japanese orders to repair the radio he'd destroyed. What followed surprised some of the villagers at the time. For about 3 months, the Japanese occupying force largely let daily life continue. People kept fishing. They kept putting up salmon for the winter. It's a detail worth including precisely, because it complicates the story rather than simplifying it. This wasn't a straight line from invasion to atrocity, and treating it that way would flatten something the record doesn't actually support. That changed in September of 1942, when Japanese forces were ordered to consolidate on nearby Kiska and evacuate everyone from Attu. The villagers, now prisoners, were put in the hold of a freighter with almost nothing. Several accounts describe the trip as days spent in the dark without seeing daylight until the ship reached Japan. Etta Jones was separated from the rest of the village early in the process and eventually held in Yokohama, first at a hotel repurposed as a detention site, later moved between other holding locations, alongside Allied military personnel and nurses, captured elsewhere in the Pacific. The Unangax villagers were sent on to a prisoner-of-war camp near Otaru, on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido, where they would remain for the rest of the war. Conditions at Otaru were bad enough that close to half the villagers taken there did not survive it. Malnutrition and disease did most of the damage over nearly 3 years of captivity. Among those who didn't come home were 2 children, a baby named Tatiana, born just before the invasion, to villagers Mike and Paraskovia Lokanen, and a second child, Gabrielle, born inside the camp itself in 1944. Both died in captivity. We know these details as specifically as we do because people who survived it eventually told their own stories, not because the military record preserved them. Nick Golodoff was 6 years old when his family was taken to Japan. Decades later, he wrote down what he remembered, and his account, compiled with a National Park Service anthropologist and his own granddaughter, became one of the only first-hand records of what the Otaru captivity was actually like from inside it, rather than from an after-action report. Almost everything in this section that isn't a military document comes, directly or indirectly, from testimony like his. There's one more piece of this. That has nothing to do with the war directly, and everything to do with what was actually lost. Each island in the Aleutian chain spoke its own dialect of the Unangax Tunu language. Attu's dialect belonged, as far as anyone can tell, to the people who were taken that September, and because none of them were ever allowed to live on Attu again, that dialect is no longer spoken by anyone alive today. In December of 1945, on their way back to Alaska, a small group of returning Attu survivors were brought to the University of Washington and recorded speaking their language onto 4 glass-based discs. Those recordings are now among the only surviving traces of how Attu's own language actually sounded. The following year, a schoolteacher named Ethel Ross Oliver was assigned to the classroom in Atka, where several of the youngest Attu survivors had landed. She later wrote about what she found. Children who spoke Russian in church, their own Attuan dialect at home, had been forced to learn Japanese during the years of captivity and were now expected to learn English and a different Aleutian dialect entirely, side by side, in the same small room. That's not a footnote either. And it shouldn't be treated as one. That's 4 languages moving through one child's life in under a decade, none of them lasting. So what does the record say happened after that, after the war ended, and there was, at least in theory, somewhere for these people to go home to? The battle to retake Attu ran from May 11th to May 30th, 1943, 19 days of combat in terrain and weather that killed and injured nearly as many American soldiers as enemy fire did, ending in one of the largest banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. Nearly 15,000 American troops fought to retake an island roughly the size of a small county against a Japanese garrison a fraction of that size that chose near total annihilation over surrender. It's a genuinely significant battle, and it's well documented. It is not, however, the least known part of this story. That distinction belongs to what happened to the people, not the soldiers. When the surviving Attu villagers were finally released and brought back toward Alaska in the fall of 1945, they were processed through relocation stations on the West Coast before continuing north. On the passenger manifest for that final journey, several of them listed their destination simply as Attu. They never got there. Here's the reasoning on the record, and it isn't a cover-up, which somehow makes it worse. Officials at the Department of the Interior reviewed the surviving Attuans' request to go home and concluded there weren't enough of them left to justify the expense. The Bureau of Indian Affairs General Superintendent for the region put it plainly at the time. Settling Attu survivors elsewhere, he said, had saved the government a considerable amount of money. 6 houses were eventually built for them instead at the village of Atka, roughly 200 miles from Attu, using salvaged military materials at what officials specifically noted was no cost to the department. 15 of the surviving villagers went to Atka. Others were split up entirely. A handful stayed behind in Seattle hospitals, some moved to Unalaska, and several orphan children were sent to a boarding school hundreds of miles away in Eklutna. The people who'd survived 3 years as prisoners of war came home to find that home had been redefined for them, on paper, as too expensive to rebuild. That's the official record's version. The community's own memory of it, recorded decades later, is shorter and plainer. One Unangax elder, George Gordoff, put it this way: in an oral history collected long after the war, everyone had understood they were going back, and it was a hard thing to accept that they simply weren't. The government, as he remembered it, had decided it wasn't going to spend the money. 2 accounts. 2 very different kinds of sources. One in a department memo, one in a survivor's memory. They agree with each other almost exactly, which is its own kind of confirmation. One thing worth separating out clearly, briefly, before moving on. While Attu's villagers were prisoners in Japan, the United States government was separately, forcibly relocating roughly 880 other Unangax people, never captured by Japan at all, into hastily built camps in southeast Alaska, where poor conditions caused serious illness and death of their own. 2 different governments, 2 different failures. Worth knowing, not worth conflating, so we won't. Back to Attu. What has happened since is worth including too, because it's not a story that simply ends in loss. In October of 2012, surviving Attu residents and their descendants gathered in Anchorage for a reunion, many of them meeting people connected to their own history for the first time. That same year, on the 75th anniversary of the invasion, a U.S. senator dedicated a memorial to the village and its people at the original site, a small marker on an island most Americans will never visit. For a community the record spent decades treating as an afterthought. In 2017, on the 75th anniversary, 11 descendants of the original Attu villagers traveled back to the island itself aboard a research vessel, the first members of their families to set foot there since the war. Among them was the mayor of Attu, a descendant of one of the original Attu families, seeing the ground her own great-grandmother had lived on for the first time in her life. They gathered wild grass for traditional basket weaving. They raised a white cross for those who never came home. More recently, descendants have organized their own nonprofit to keep that access going, working to make return trips to Attu a sustained practice rather than a one-time commemoration. Some form of accounting did eventually arrive, decades late, and from two different directions. In 1951, Japan itself offered survivors a small annual payment for 3 years. One family turned it down outright, calling it an insult next to what had actually been lost, a small act of refusal that says as much about what happened as any government document does. In 1988, Congress passed the Aleut and Pribilof Islands Restitution Act, formally acknowledging the wartime treatment of Unangax communities and paying survivors a fixed sum, money that, by every account, did little to make up for what a childhood, a language, or a home actually costs. The last person who had actually been held at Attu as a child died only a few years ago, which means this is no longer a story anyone alive can correct or add to firsthand. Whatever accounting still needs to happen, it's running out of people who were actually there to receive it. Etta Jones survived her own captivity, 39 months held separately from the village she taught in, ending as one of the first American civilians released by Japan at the war's end. For part of that time, she was held alongside Australian nurses captured elsewhere in the Pacific, and later alongside American servicemen taken prisoner on Kiska, the island next door to the one she'd called home. Her husband's body wasn't recovered and identified until September of 1945, 3 years after his death. He's buried today at a national cemetery in Alaska. The radio he destroyed rather than hand over is long gone. What he actually managed to send out that morning, 3 words, warning that the invasion had begun, is one of the only pieces of this story that made it into the official record in real time. Everything else came later, and came from the people who lived through it, not the people who wrote the after-action reports. The Lokanen family's story closes a little differently, and it's worth sitting with on its own. Mike and Paraskovia Lokanen survived Otaru. Their infant daughter, Tatiana, did not. Years afterward, on the trip home, it was Mike and Paraskovia's voices, among a handful of others, that ended up on those 4 glass discs at the University of Washington, the last recorded sound of a language that no longer has anyone left to speak it. A family that lost a child in a prison camp also turned out to be one of the last places that language existed at all. Those two facts aren't connected by cause and effect. They're connected by having happened to the same handful of people, in the same handful of years, on the same island. The record still mostly remembers as a footnote to a battle. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. If you're drawn to the kind of history that sits in the space between the official record and what the people who actually lived it remembered, that's exactly what this channel is built around. So consider subscribing if you want more of it. Here's the question we'll leave you with. These were American citizens, freed after 3 years as prisoners of war, and their own government decided, on paper, that bringing them home cost too much. Is that an explanation you find sufficient? Tell us what you think in the comments.